the early bear to benefit most learn first? The first ones to recognize something are the first to benefit from it, or the first to have the opportunity to benefit from it. And they also have the opportunity to benefit from it the most, if not only because they have the opportunity to benefit from it the longest. Others who recognize something much later not only have less opportunity to benefit, but the benefits available to them by that time may be much smaller, much harder to obtain, and much riskier to obtain. So to benefit most, learn first. We're going to talk in less abstract terms and now give some examples. The image there is a picture of a bear looking up towards a big mountain, and it says in the orange background, you already know about the early bird getting the most worms, much more easily than the later birds. What about the early bear? In spring, the early bear begins as the only bear around. The early bear gets the world. The early bear gets it all, at least for as long as it's the only bear around, right? So you've heard that the early bird gets the worm. That's true. At sunrise, the first birds to get on the ground and look for worms can easily find lots of worms. At that time, there are still many worms right out in the open. As each bird finds a worm, the worms quickly get eaten. So more birds continue to arrive and eat the remaining worms faster and faster. Later, because there are fewer and fewer worms left to be found, the later birds only find a new worm coming out into the open occasionally. For the last birds to arrive, it can eventually become very difficult to find a single worm. So you already know about the early bird getting the most worms, and much more easily than the later birds. What about the early bear? And there's the picture with the bear on the blue ice with the orange sun at sunrise and the orange sunlight. It's kind of a pretty picture there. So you may know that bears can sleep through an entire winter, several months of sleep. They go into a den typically and sleep for several months. They don't even wake up to urinate and so on like other hibernating animals. I'm not going to get into the detail of the science of it because it's not important, but it's actually pretty interesting if you study what bears are capable of doing in the winter as they sleep all that time. But if you imagine, an entire winter is almost over, and the bears have all been sleeping throughout the winter, then finally when one of them wakes up, the first meal of the spring is very important to them because they haven't eaten for 3 months. So have you ever had a morning where you felt that hungry? Probably not. 3 months? No. But it's a long time to be asleep and not eat. So when that first bear wakes up, when the early bear wakes up, and all the other bears are still sleeping, the early bear can easily find an abundance of food, berries, honey, fish, whatever is available. It's available in relative abundance. There's no competition of other bears, and it's easy to find. So because of all, so as more bears wake up from their deep sleep, they also start eating, right? And because of all the hungry bears just waking up, the early abundance of food, berries, fish, honey, and so on, can quickly disappear, can quickly shift from abundance to scarcity. In a particularly harsh winter, if there's not much food around when that first bear wakes up, then that bear may be the only one at all who gets to eat, or who gets to eat to the point of being full, being satisfied. The other bears may begin to starve if there's not a lot of food left by the time they wake up, then they may begin to starve. So if they do not eat soon after waking, then what will happen to them? They soon could die. If they are in that somewhat weakened state after 3 months of sleeping and they don't get any food for quite a while, or don't get much food for quite a while, that can impair their ability to hunt and even to compete with the other bears in terms of finding things quickly and scaring off the other bears if they're in the same area. So it's important to get that first meal after several months of not eating, right? As spring goes on, then of course much more food will become available. However, if the later bears, the last ones to wake up, are no longer alive, then the early bear gets it all. So the early bear begins as the only bear around, and the early bear gets the world, at least as long as they're the only bear around. I really like this picture with the metallic blue, slate blue background and the brown bear. Why is this principle of the early bear benefiting most by learning first and getting the world? Why is this principle so important, including for the most profitable methods of stock market investing? Well, as I said, the first ones to recognize something are the first to benefit from it. They are also likely to benefit the most. While others are still dreaming about yesterday or next century, the first to wake up can easily access the most favorable outcomes. They avoid the crowds, they avoid the rush. They avoid the scarcity or even panic that others may later experience. While the early bear is already making easy and huge advances, the bears who are still sleeping may get little or nothing, no matter how hard they work. If there's no food left, they can be very sincere in wanting to find it, and they can say all the affirmations they want, but if there is no food left in that area, then they're not going to find it, no matter how hard they look. And they may not be able to go to another area in time to keep themselves alive. So the early bear also avoids the primary risk of the herd of bulls. Like a herd of bulls they get all excited and they go on a stampede and they end up running over a cliff. Well, the bear, if they're early, if there's no pressure on them because there's no there's no excitement around their research, there's no excitement around their exploration, or there's no huge social excitement. There's no parade and there's no euphoria and so on. There's just curiosity. The early bear is curious, methodical, systematic, logical, sorts through the details, makes analysis, tests the conclusions and presumptions. That's going to avoid the primary risk of the herd of bulls, which is neglecting to test their presumptions. The bulls don't test their presumptions. They see, well, everybody else has that presumption, so I can count on the presumption to be true because it's very popular. That is the primary risk of the bulls. All of them run off the cliff together. Bears are solitary creatures on the whole, and they rely on their own observation, their own perception. So they refine their perception, or in order for them to survive well and thrive, it requires a lot of independent self-reliance, independent thinking, independent cognitive processing. They're not relying on other bears' sense of smell and what those bears told them. They're relying on their own sense of smell, their own eyesight, their own hearing. So the presumptions and excitement of the bulls is the only way for a herd, for a bull to run off a cliff, is with a herd. Bulls by themselves wouldn't run off a cliff because they'd be able to see it. But if there's a herd of them, then all they see in front of them is the butt of the bull in front of them, the other members of the herd right in front of them. Now, how do the first ones who are running end up running off the cliff? Well, they can't stop in time. By the time they see the cliff, or by the time they see that they're coming up to the edge that could be a cliff, they're going really fast. And guess what? There's a bunch of bulls right behind them. So if they stop, they still get pushed over the edge by the other bulls. So the primary risk of the herd of bulls is neglecting to test their presumptions out of emotional and social confidence. So rather than actually test presumptions, there's just a euphoric surge of groupthink, you might say. So again, bears have the relaxed, calm, uninterrupted opportunity to review presumptions, to test them, to measure them, to see how true is that? How confident am I in that? Today, next month, last month, and so on. We can actually measure things repeatedly. Bulls don't measure at all. They just have their presumptions. They may not even know that they're presumptions. They may think that their presumptions are truths, are facts, are uncontroversial. However, many of the rationalizations that bulls state, I'm talking here about investment market bulls, many of the rationalizations that bulls state are false. They're not even inaccurate or they're not even imprecise. They're completely inaccurate. They're actually ridiculous and hysterical in some cases. However, other presumptions are merely imprecise. And again, because of the social reinforcement of the bulls and the herd, the bulls typically don't examine their presumptions. They don't even have a lot of sensitivity to what is a presumption and what isn't a presumption. They don't, they just gauge themselves off of the rest of the herd. And there are certainly advantages to having a herd around if you're a bull, or if you're a bison or any of those kinds of creatures. For those creatures, it's better to be in a pack than by themselves, perhaps. But for other creatures, such as bears, they do quite well in a solitary lifestyle. And because of their lack of concern for social approval or social acknowledgement even, they can operate with a lot of calm. People who are actually shy are still typically concerned about being embarrassed or humiliated or disliked. They're afraid of being rejected. Bears, they're used to being alone, so they're not concerned if another creature walks away, withdraws and walks off on the bear. How is that going to concern the bear? That's fine. It's no big deal at all. In fact, if someone approaches a bear, or another bear approaches a bear, then the bears will probably have more concern about that than if someone rejects the bear and withdraws. And when I say the bear will have more concern about approaches, they'll have more interest in approaches too. They're just not interested in people rejecting them or withdrawing from them, or other bears withdrawing from them. It's not an issue, because they're not anxious about a dependency on a herd or a pack. They're solitary creatures. They're self-sufficient. Certainly, when mating season comes along, you do get two bears together. But for the most part, bears are happy and healthy in their solitude. That doesn't mean they can't gather with other bears, but there's no particular advantage to them necessarily to gather with other bears, because they're so capable of providing for themselves. They don't need a socialist kind of a security blanket. This isn't really on the subject of bears, which was the focus of this talk, but I'll get back to my script soon. I've made reference to mountain climbers many times. So if you have very skilled mountain climbers, you take like 5 or 15 mountain climbers that are very skilled, and you tie them together, that does increase their safety to be tied to each other. So a small group can be very safe. But a herd, if you have 500,000 mountain climbers that all tie themselves together, and none of them are especially good at mountain climbing, that can lead to a disaster for the entire group. And that's more what the situation is for bulls. On a flat terrain, being tied to 500,000 others is probably okay, but once you get into the ridges and the cliffs and everything, if all the other ones are going fast, you've got to go fast to keep up with them if you're tied to them. And that is not something that mountain climbers do, because mountain climbers aren't that dumb. But bulls are easily excited. They have very strong hormones like testosterone. And so they can get easily excited and riled up, and they're all passionate, and they're all running very fast toward a cliff, and all in a tight pack with each other, all together. Interesting stuff. So the bear, especially the early bear, avoids the primary risk of the herd of bulls, which is neglecting to test presumptions. Neglecting to even reflect on presumptions. While a herd of raging bulls is excitedly stampeding over a cliff, bears can remain calm, confident, clear, curious, and courageous. Their curiosity leads to confidence, because their curiosity leads to clarity, which leads in turn to confidence, because they are clear. So they know, they've tested their presumptions, and they know how to test their presumptions in the future. They know that their presumptions are presumptions. So they're interested in measuring the accuracy of whatever the presumption might be. And if the data or the measurement indicates something contrary to their prior presumption, then they change their presumption, because they know it's a presumption. Bulls seem not to have that mental capacity. Or they're not using that capacity if they have it in many cases, perhaps due to the excitement of hormones and cortisol and adrenaline and testosterone and so on. So the early bear is committed to making the most of the resources available. They're not wasteful, they're not presumptive, they're deliberate, systematic, careful, responsible, and thus they're effective, prosper. So the next picture there is a bear that's in water. I just thought it's a cute picture. That's basically it. The bear looks like it's smiling. So be open to learning. Further, this is not all of what I'm saying. This is not just about noticing investment realities before the herd and then making huge, easy profits from that early clarity. It is about that, but it's not just about that. If you notice anything before the herds notice it, that gives you an immense advantage, right? I haven't really given any detail about specific cases as it relates to markets. And I don't think I'm going to give any detail as it relates to health, but I'm going to talk now about health briefly. When researchers first discover a new method for promoting health, not everyone finds out at the same time. The early bears find out, they're calm, they're curious, they're not really concerned about other people's approval or other people's presumptions. They're going to use their own discernment to assess, is this something valuable to me, and how credible is it, and so on. And they make those assessments independently. That doesn't mean they don't study other people's commentaries and other people's experiments and research and results and so on, but their assessment is really their own assessment. They're not borrowing someone else's assessment and defending an assessment that they heard from some other presumed authority. So when researchers first discover a new method for promoting health, not everyone learns at the same time. Not everyone learns about it at the same time. To benefit most, learn first. That's the key of what makes an early bear an early bear. The herds may not be responsive to new methods for promoting health. They tend to be devoted to the familiar, to the popular, not necessarily the well-tested, not necessarily well-established, but well-publicized. The herds may be waiting for a familiar authority in the mass media to give an endorsement to a certain idea before they dare to risk learning something new. They're not really open to learning. They want the teacher to give them the answer to the test, and then they repeat back to the teacher the answer that the teacher gave them, and then they get the social acknowledgement of the A or the 100 on their piece of paper on their exam. They get their degree, they get their diploma, etc. They get their certificate and their license and so on. But they're not likely to do controversial research. The herds don't do controversial research. They don't do any research at all. They're not in the process of learning. They're in the process of, well, if I would say they're in the process of learning, they're only in the process of learning what the authority, the perceived authority, presents to them. So they keep tuned in to the authority who repeats the same slogans and presumptions over and over and over, and occasionally some new information, some new ideas. But until the mass media endorses an idea, the herds typically are going to be dismissive or skeptical, and there's a good reason for that. And the reason is they don't have the confidence in their own analytical abilities to make a determination of whether or not something is accurate. So they're waiting for the mass media to tell them what's important to them, and then what's credible and what's useful, what's accurate, what's the right thing to do, and so on. So that's how the herds operate. The bear, or the relatively solitary thinker, is open to learning. They're open to refining their presumptions. If there's a past mistake, if they are interested in updating it, refining it, correcting it. If the bear used to be in a herd of bulls, the bear will admit that. If the bear used to be waiting for an authority to tell them what their priorities should be and what their values should be and what should be important to them, the bear can admit that's been an influence on them in the past. The bear can admit in the past the endorsement of a perceived authority, such as a classroom teacher or a college professor or the mass media personality. Those endorsements were things that the bear in the past may have considered valuable and relevant, but now the bear may either consider those things irrelevant or actually have skepticism toward anything that the mass media presents or anything that public education presents. Well, it must be a few years old for it to have gone through the curriculum approval process. It can't be groundbreaking. So if that's something that's presented in 4th grade, well, you don't need to know necessarily the latest research if you're a 4th grader. But if you get into the higher levels of a field, then the latest research seems like a really good thing to be aware of. Even high school students could be researching the latest research in any particular field. If their teachers aren't intelligent enough to work with high school students that are doing groundbreaking research or reading groundbreaking research, then that's a sign about the teacher. But hopefully teachers, I say hopefully, in some cases teachers will be threatened by intelligent students bringing in information that may be unfamiliar to the teacher. And in some cases, some teachers may be particularly open, even encouraging of students to look in particular directions or to present whatever, and the teacher may be comfortable maintaining the integrity of the classroom process and the learning process. That some teachers are really interested in learning. Other teachers are more interested in training the students to repeat slogans and presumptions for passing tests. So there's a big difference there between learning and memorization, comprehension and memorization. So we know that a 2-year-old child can memorize the sounds of a song that's a foreign language, and they can actually say it pretty well, but that doesn't mean they know a single word's meaning. They don't know anything about what the song means or what the individual words mean. They just memorize the sounds. Nothing wrong with memorizing sounds, but it's not to be confused with comprehension. So when researchers first discover a new method for promoting health, the herds are not likely to be receptive. Why would they be? If the mass media authority hasn't presented them an endorsement, then a predictable response from the herd would be skepticism, perhaps even ridicule. The herd doesn't want the embarrassment of being faced with the possibility that their presumptions are in fact presumptions. Might even be inaccurate or imprecise. So the herds are the perfect perfectionists. That means they never, ever want to make even a single mistake. And what's the best way to avoid all mistakes and all failures? Never do anything. especially not anything new. Further, if the herds ever do make a mistake, they do not want to admit it or have anyone find out and criticize them, because they're so concerned about the reputation that they have within their little herd or their big herd. They're just really anxious about their reputation. And we can respect that. Most people who are at the point of being a investment bear or someone interested in holistic health, many of those people went through some stages of exposure to mainstream conventional presumptions, mythology, superstitions, what I like to call the demon worship model of medicine, where something like arthritis is spoken of like a substance, like a living entity that comes into a body and possesses the body and starts to spread and grow and attack the things, to attack the, the joints, and causes inflammation. Arthritis causes inflammation, is that right? Because I thought arthritis was a label for inflammation. So many of the herds aren't examining their presumptions, so they're just worshiping arthritis as a demon that possesses organisms and then attacks them and damages them. Arthritis is a label for an effect. Arthritis is not a cause. Likewise, the vast majority of diagnostic labels refer to symptoms or effects. There are cases where we can say, here's the sequence of events and here's this catalyst that is an outside organism like a tick. And the tick bites some creature and then a certain sequence of events happens. And actually, I didn't plan to say this, but Lyme disease would be an example that fits with the idea of an outside organism, a tick, bites something and then a certain sequence of results follows that. But Lyme disease isn't a living thing. It's not a substance necessarily. And it's possible that bacteria or viruses are alive. In fact, I think of bacteria as living things. Viruses typically are presented as living things, but that's another issue. We're not going to address that issue here. What I do want to address is that this idea that whatever the mainstream has publicized is accurate, that idea has a very bad history. We can take the case of scurvy. Anyone ever been possessed by the demon of scurvy? Anyone ever had surgery to remove the demon of scurvy from their organism? No, because scurvy is a diagnostic label for a certain level of vitamin C within an organism. So scurvy is a relative absence of something. It's not an incurable, contagious thing. There's no genetic predispositions. Even if you can say these people in this area, this region of the world, and with this cultural habit of diet, they have a correlation between if their ancestors had scurvy, then they also had scurvy. That doesn't make it genetic. One of the biggest issues in medical science and science in general, but medical science in particular, is correlation being presented as cause. The diagnosis of arthritis corresponds to pain, but to say that arthritis caused pain or the diagnosing of arthritis causes pain, that's ridiculous. The pain was there, that's why somebody went to the doctor, and then they went to the doctor said, oh, you have arthritis, and the person then is now possessed by a demon, and then the pain is just the same as it was before. Or maybe there's a little bit of, panic and terror now that they've been told, oh, arthritis, oh my. But other than terrifying patients, the label arthritis doesn't cause a increase in inflammation or an increase in pain. So the herds like social validation for their presumptions and their practices and behaviors. The herds also do not like to admit prior cases of the herd mentality being completely inaccurate. So I mentioned scurvy. Classic examples are the idea that the earth is flat and the idea that the sun orbits the earth. In fact, it's now popularly recognized that the earth orbits the sun. But there were times and places where it was very popular to believe that the sun orbited the earth. And Aristarchus in like 230 BC in Greece presented that idea. He was the first recorded case of someone presenting that I'm aware of. And it was widely rejected. People knew better, except that they were wrong. But they weren't receptive to this unfamiliar idea. They didn't necessarily look at the data closely. They didn't really consider the information. And how important was it to them in 230 BC in Greece? Probably not that important. So, fine. If they said, we dismiss your idea as irrelevant, that would be one thing. But what we do find in some cases, at least with herds, is that they will ridicule and attack contrary propositions, contrary ideas. It's to be expected. That's the natural response for a herd. Why? Because herds have a latent panic. That's why they're, herd animals, like a flock of birds, they're really tuned in to the other creatures. That's part of their biological structure and program. They're really tuned into the other creatures, and they will panic if the others panic. Not because they've identified a particular danger, but just because they've noticed that the other birds in the flock are panicking, so they panic as well. And that is adaptive. That is good for the flock of birds on the whole. They're presuming danger whenever the rest of the group panics. Now, the other thing, though, with bulls, with investment bulls, you've got a bunch of individuals who are presuming very enthusiastically that something is safe. That's actually different than presuming that that there's a threat, or presuming that there's a risk or a danger. They're presuming that something is safe and aren't. They're even dismissive of their own direct observation because they're concerned about their reputation within their familiar herd. So these herds, if they ever do make a mistake, they do not want to admit it or have anyone find out that they ever had made a mistake and then be subject to criticism. They're concerned about being criticized for past mistakes. So they don't want to admit mistakes in general, certainly not publicly. If they do make a mistake, what's the first thing that someone in a herd will do? They'll blame someone else. I made that mistake because of, and that's understandable as well, and it may even be relevant, but in many cases we see herds like housing market investors or stock market investors, something goes wrong and they're happy to blame a politician or a company or their broker or, oh, it was my realtor. My realtor said that, da-da-da-da. Well, actually, a lot of real estate speculators don't blame their realtors, but consider someone buying a lottery ticket and then saying, oh, the cashier didn't warn me that this could be worthless. Or, I can't believe that the state of Arizona sold me this ticket. I thought the state of Arizona was going to do things that were beneficial to me. I'm a resident here, and I went and spent $600 on lottery tickets, and now they're all of them lost? Wow, that's I want my money back. Well, you know, the thing is, that's not how the lottery works. So when people are gambling on real estate speculation and borrowing huge amounts of money, chances are good that eventually they'll go bankrupt. If they keep doing that without ever assessing market risks, it's a bad long-term investment strategy to just flip houses on huge, with tiny down payments and huge percentages of financing the purchase. If you just do that over and over and over and over, eventually the market's going to turn down, and that's it. So the herd of bulls is often looking for who to blame. It could be their wife, their husband, their parents, their school teacher, their realtor, their lawyer, their governor, their president, their Wall Street, their brokerage advisor, whoever it is. They're in a mode of blame. And frankly, that also makes a lot of sense, because by blaming those parties, they can distance themselves from those parties, just in case those people were detrimental to their well-being. They distance themselves from all those people, and at least for a moment, it doesn't have to last, but for a moment they repel those other people and distance themselves from their prior perceived alliance, and blame is how they do that. So if they're in a public circumstance and they are revealed as being in error, they also are likely to distract, to change the subject, and even to throw tantrums. Not just tantrums of blame, but any kind of tantrum. They're nervous, they're anxious, they're interested in someone else saying to them, it's okay that you made a mistake. So if they've rarely had the experience of other people telling them it's okay for you to make a mistake, then they're going to naturally be concerned anytime they're thinking, oh, I might have made a mistake here. Well, then they're not going to want to research it. If they're thinking, if I did make a mistake, then somebody's going to find out, and then it's going to go horribly. In contrast, somebody else thinks, I might have made a mistake, and they're interested in finding out, did I make a mistake or not? And they, out of their curiosity, become clear, and then they can become confident. They also learn, and in learning, they update their presumptions. They update their perspective, their model. Next, we have a bear. It looks like it's dancing. It's not really dancing, but those 3 different photos of the same bear in its different motions look like it's dancing. Cute. So we have one more little section and then a few questions, or one question. The next section is avoid the paranoia of the herd. The terrified herds may cling desperately to presumptions that keep them from being curious about new insights. They may even ridicule the early bear for not joining the stampede of naive, passionate bulls and daring to question the bullish hysterias, or daring to attempt to warn the bulls about the fact that the bullish hysteria is a bullish hysteria. A movement of terror, of panic. In fact, the herds may even label their blind loyalty to whatever is familiar to them in a very remarkable way. They may call their panics of blind loyalty being skeptical, or even scientific. How ironic, right? They may be paranoid that their own sincerity may be revealed as naive, and precise, and complete, and accurate, erroneous, just plain wrong. They're desperate to have the security of clear approval from a perceived authority, to protect any consensus idea as sacred and safe, lasting, eternal, plus to avoid criticism and to avoid learning. Because learning implies that they didn't already know it all, which is humbling for some bulls who may have an element of arrogance in their concern for their social reputation. They may have an element of arrogance. So the herd manifests the herd mentality. Now, the idea that the herd mentality should not exist is a sign of still operating from a herd mentality. If I'm operating from a herd mentality, one kind of way of operating from a herd mentality is to say what should not exist. Anything that I say should not exist is probably from a herd mentality. In particular, if I say herd mentality should not exist, that's probably operating from a herd mentality. Consider it. So likewise, someone who says that everyone should be above average, they're either joking, insincere in their comment, or they're not very familiar with what the word average means. Everyone should be above average. The herd mentality should not exist. Winter should not exist. The color orange should not exist. Why are we constructing statements about what should not exist, assertions, denials about what should not exist? Why would someone do that except because of concern for conforming to some ideal that's popular within a particular herd? They're concerned about their reputation. And, understandably. Now, make the right choice for you. This is the 3 alternatives that I present to you, A, B, and C. A, yes, I like where this is going. I'm ready to learn more about noticing important information early. I'm ready to learn about insights regarding wealth, health, and perhaps some things that are even more important to me. B, no, I do not like it. You people are to blame for everything that is wrong with the world. Before reading this, I was completely satisfied. Before listening to this, I was completely satisfied with everything in my life and totally free of any form of confusion, according to me. But now you've managed to confuse me, insult me, and also confuse me. Plus, I can't even believe that I wasted my time this long. Because I'm terribly embarrassed, now I will go find some mainstream news so they can tell me what is important to argue about, to think about, and to argue about, to talk about, and to argue about with anyone bored enough to argue with me. Oh, and by the way, if I were to take any further time with you, it would be as an act of mercy to call you on the phone to let you know exactly why I do not want to talk to you at all for at least an hour. After that, if you'll stop interrupting for just 1 minute, okay, 41 minutes later, then I may switch subjects to how my analysis is that I have absolutely no time at all for all of that unchristian analytical jibber-jabber that you were using to attack me. Okay, any questions so far? That was answer B. Now answer C. Maybe some of that was at least a little clever. I admit that I'm curious or even intrigued, though I do have some questions first. What is the best way to get my questions answered? And then there's a picture of the bear, which is yawning. You may not know that that bear is yawning, but it is. Above that is a picture of a black bear with a really long tongue. If you didn't know how long, and a really weird face in that moment of itching itself and you know. But if you didn't know that bears had really long tongues, check out these pictures. They certainly do. When I say these pictures, I'll put the link in the video, in the comments of the video. Hopefully you were already aware of that prior to this time, since I've been referring to pictures all along. So what's the best way to get my questions answered? Well, you can leave a comment on the video. If you know how to reach me, you can contact me and present to me a question. If your answer is A, you can simply contact me and say, I'd like to know more. Thanks for listening. This has been The Early Bear. To benefit Merce, learn first. I pronounced that wrongly. Let me correct myself. Okay? Thanks. To benefit most, learn first. The early bear gets the world.